Okay, welcome back to the second session. It's called Epidemic. Unfortunately, for personal reasons, Aspasia's Spano can't be here, so I'm going to be Aspasia. I'm going to read her paper, which is called Openness and Vampiric Contagion. Black Metal's Vampiric Transfusional Alliance cuts across descensional affiliation, spinning lateral webs of contagious death, opening a vacuum of radical openness, where heads are butchered and mouths chew, scavenge and infect cadavers, living and dead matter, a necrophilic feast towards a germinal unlife. The vampire of black metal is reborn from the earth's entrails, and from blessed in sin, earthly. A vermin of undifferentiated matter, pest warfare machines, and acephalic mouths infested with black plague and infecting the race of Oedipus. Tomorrow has already been cremated in hell. Quote from Nick Land. Nosferatu is not the anthropomorphic embodiment of the thing, the agent of plague, and Nos of Horos, the bringer of Gnosos, the bringer of disease. The vampire emerges through necrophilic mess, summoned from the composition of wounds and scars and their fibro-proliferative meltdown, death mess, from Nagarastani's Kepler's mouth. In the infected space of death, both vampire and prey are consumed in their mutual anonymity, brutally buffeted by wave after wave of unfamiliar sensations, where living and dead flesh is unfolded and refolded in an unbearable ecstasy. Vampirism has been associated in folklore and literature with disease, the epidemics of the plague, pestilence, contagion, tuberculosis, and viruses. While it has been served as a delectable dish to be consumed by voracious readers, satisfying their appetite for romanticized, dangerous, and alluring counts, controlled and excluded in the end as monstrosities, black metal participates in an unholy, perverse production of contagious becomings through the opening of life towards infected death. The vampire infects, does not reproduce. The vampire is always a multiplicity without the union of an ancestor. The vampire proliferates by contagion and epidemics which have nothing to do with filiation by heredity. Contagion and epidemic involve terms that are heterogeneous, for example, a human being, an animal, and a bacterium, a virus, a molecule, a microorganism. These combinations are neither genetic nor structural, they are inter-kingdom, unnatural participations. That is the only way nature operates against itself. This is a far cry from filiative production or hereditary reproduction, in which the only differences retained are a simple duality between sexes within the same species and small ramifications across generations. And that's from Elizabeth Harry's. These unnatural participations do not produce interbreedings, but generate differences and unnatural alliances through contagion. Becoming vampire is not a teleological process, but an intermingling through encounter, a perverse encounter of life with death and decay. Emerging from decay and not born, vampires have no origins, no history, and thus no stable meaning. Between life and death, pain and pleasure, seduction and horror, vampires are both inside and outside life, culture, and its productions, transgressing, polluting, and dissolving boundaries. According to Nagarastani, vampires emerge through an exposure to a necrophilic mess. They are not created. They are neither created nor specialized, surface specializations of the ground, as the agents in merely sub-blood or spectral colonials, but they are summoned from exhumed surfaces, from the deepest collisions and labyrinthine compositions of solid and void, the fibro-proliferation of surfaces and voiding process, from the compositions of wounds and scars and their fibro-proliferative meltdown, death nets. Black metal emerges from such a space infested with the undead. Smell, hideous stench, senses reeling from the sight, decomposition everywhere, a taste of death invades the air, flies and rats feast in an unholy gathering on maggot-infested corpses, the carrion rotted and dismembered, victims of brutal butchery. Suddenly the cadavers rise, putrefied pus, spurting from sores, as shattered limbs begin to move, shrieking in horror. That's from Night World, Another Victim. Infested by insects and butchered from the grave, the black metal persona awakens. Back from the pits of my grave, I am the walking undead, autopsy gothic streaming deep. Gnawed from our own entrails by an irreversible disease, the vampire arises, weeping births in growing vampire. Life and death are infected, resurrected putrid cadavers, defying death and mocking life's decay, at space of evils eternally blasphemed. In this respect, following Deleuze, Keith Ansel Pearson refers to the new possibilities of existence where organic life is invited to open itself up to the open system of the outside, not to resist the temptation of the demonic and the monstrous, but to encounter those dark precursors, the difference in itself, which relate heterogeneous systems and the disparate. The horror of the vampire engenders excess. It is a radical affective force that breaks down barriers, representation, bodies, and subjectivities. It leads towards a traumatizing abjection. On the other hand, such a desire for openness, as Nagarastani points out, should not be confused with the desire to be open to, which has been domesticated by various institutions and networks, economical, political, or social, to express affordance. According to ecological perceptual psychology and the work of James Jerome Gibson, humans perceive affordances, opportunities for action, openings, and not simply objects. The environment, materials, social, and cultural are perceived as affordances or advantages. Their openness is translated into what they can offer the receiver and what kind of actions will be able to be performed on or with the specific qualities of such things. For Nagarastani, being open is a survivalist strategy that poses limits and organisation and is against contagion and the total fury of openness. In this sense, the vampire disrupts such survivalist projects and appropriations of openness. A figure of unproductive expenditure and waste, it goes against capitalism's necrocratic rationalization, normalization, and valuation of death. Despite its associations with capitalism and necrocracy, playfully exemplified in J.G. Acarius' The Last Days of Christ the Vampire, 1988, the vampire infects life and its institutions, opening up a space of contagious becomings, a necrophilic space where death is forever postponed and life disintegrates. Richard Matheson's I Am Legend proposes such a contagious space of life-infested death. Between living people and vampires, the still living vampires are infected humans with the vampire virus, not living nor dead, who are creating out of the infected space of life a new undead life. Similarly, black metal envisions an infected space with vampires. The undead roam the streets, humans gathered into a herd, then torn apart like husks of meat. Let the darkness surround you, smother you in its sick embrace, incurable contagion seeping into your pores, filling your throat, polluting your blood, poisoning your very being. Coffin birds, cemetery nights. Like Matheson's vampires, in such a space, philia, nothing remains pure, since tendencies which try to force purity are all contaminated and infected. There is no possibility of destroying that which decays, but persists on infecting death, spreading contagion and pestilence. There is no place of remaining stable, fixed, and pure. Neville understands the epidemic openness of vampires. He remains isolated, looking back into a nostalgic past that never was, where decay, germs, bacteria were already there, chewing, disintegrating life, mutating, preparing their insurgence and epidemic spread. The ugly painter world where the legions of the undead will infect life, creating a new world of undead corpses. In the sign of death, we march towards the holy light, our flag held high. It bears the mark of our skull in the sign of stench. Hear our moans and hear our cries, the cries of war, a war that you living have feared so long. Sharpen your teeth, grind your nails and peel your skin. Fill in our ranks, all from rotten to disease. The loss of limbs compensated by our reeking hate. Your time has come, there will be no more life. From the ugliest hierarchy to the undead. This is the blackening of a life defined by blood, pain, death. I live in death. Vatican plagues beyond the grave. Being infected and not annihilated, the vampiric body and the other enter a space where they are radically opened. Flesh peeled, entrails, bodies reorganized, new possibilities open up through the contagious bonds of philia. The attraction to vampirism and epidemic openness is anti-sobriety. an attraction towards being laid open. Extreme seductiveness is probably at the boundary of horror. Being open through necrophilia, death is not domesticated, it goes rabid. Death is messed up and open. It is an endless decay and decomposition, a descent without stoppage and without unity. Affirmation traverses radical openness, not as a joyful openness, but as an infection that triggers openness in the sense of mess. Vampires and necrophiles inhabit and infect life as Yuri Mamleyev's metaphysical realism attacks. A life in hell where death and life have been mutually contaminated and butchered. The vampire's bite might bestow immortality, but not as a liberating openness or a celebration of eternal happiness, but as a radical opening towards possession, defilement, and progressive ungrounding. There is no yes when you are lacerated open, when you experience the end of possibility of your closure. When death bleeds into life, it is contaminated and infested with germinality, an epidemic openness which infects but also is a space of becomings and heterogeneities giving rise to new things. If for Nagarstani, Russian necro-realism exemplifies such an epidemic openness, especially then, or equally then, the British New Brutalists of the 1990s, such as Sarah Kane and Edward Bond, have produced out of chaos, decay, and death works that are vampiric, depicting a germinal unlife, where death is always beside the characters in a satanic intimacy, a closeness that ungrounds any evil regimes, rapidly spreading contagion and leading to a brutal and inevitable openness. Black metal's infernal Lilith is the bringer of tormenting plagues, inviting the living to copulate with her and experience her venomous kiss and a mutual contamination. In their mutual exchange, the other feeds on the satanic feminine, driven into pure blackness, perversion of the wildest shape, pulling me towards this black hole in her mind. That's from Lyra Pelgatis, soul above all others. Through vampiric infection, new possibilities arise, and by your blood I will corrupt, myself confused with you, demon and bride, forged in shadow undead, I'm born anew with you. That's from Zurius Archangel. The antidote for the horror of existence and despair is not the thirst for annihilation, but the will to radical and epidemic openness, a death that is undying. My bleeding soul will ascend into the other spheres. And that's from Veritatis Nepsis, Black Wings. I'd like to thank Aspasia for, in very difficult circumstances, writing that paper, and it was a pleasure to be able to read it for her. Our next presentation on the epidemic strand or strain is Scott Wilson, whose paper is entitled Musica and Musica and the Sound of Satan's Ascension.
I've just been assassinated. Way to go. Okay. Begin with a short epigraph from the magazine Terrorizer, which says that true black metal occultists like the sound of black metal, like black metal, the sound like flies buzzing in a tin. It may seem that this paper is on a particular thematic, lyrical thematic in black metal, but it's really about the sound. Okay, flies are a frequent trope in both black and death metal. For the latter, buzzing flies pullulating over a rotting corpse lyrically figures death metal's pulverizing asubjective affections of the body. For the former, flies are related to a metaphysical problem bound up with how, in relationship to the principle of the one, or the one God, evil poses the question of duality, or the multiple. Of course, this is a conventional problem, but flies take it in interesting directions. Index of the fallen world of filth, disease, and suffering, the ubiquity of musca domestica have led them to become a wonderful figure of the precariousness of life in the face of virulence and the exchange of human violence in an economy of evil. No doubt, since The migration of Homo sapiens from Africa, Musca domestica, have been the constant companions and noisy neighbours of human beings, lodging in the margins of human civilization, incubating and pupating in its shit and garbage, feeding on wounds and rotting flesh, defecating and vomiting waste matter, teeming in deadly bacteria and viruses, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis, and on. They constantly test the ingenuity of human knowledge concerning the limits of the human condition and the human organism's agreement with its environment. At the same time, not hurting a fly is the acme of Christian pity and Buddhist piety. Being a fly in the ointment is the desire of anyone hoping to subvert the repressive system and so on. That is, disturb and reconfigure the environment. The housefly is, therefore, a perfect object of ecological desire, named after the oikos or eco-ecology in economy. It is a companion species, a co-dweller in our house and environment, living off the waste products that define and embroil every culture. The fly accompanies me everywhere, wherever I live, a neighbour with whom I share my home, but who does not treat it like one. In a famous comment in The World as Will and Idea on the higher capacity of suffering in complex beings relative to apparently simpler life forms, Schopenhauer notes that every time a man swats a fly, he implicitly, quote, acknowledges that the fly suffers less from being killed than the man suffers from being annoyed by it. Here we see that the relation between man and animal is organised by an economy of suffering, articulated by the locus of sound, part of the ambient environment that seemingly disagrees with him, in which the fly's buzzing signifies a sovereign indifference that is enjoyed at the expense of the philosopher. Another quote from Schopenhauer: black metal theorist Alain Lalette, as Eugene Hacker has noted before, and has become famous as an image of the fly's sovereignty. In Studies in Pessimism, he writes, the fly ought to be used as a symbol of impertinence and audacity. For whilst all other animals shun man more than anything else, and run away even before he comes near them, the fly lights upon his very nose. Speaking as a philosopher, as if a philosopher, I could say that the fly is a partner with whom I can identify, but who is also other, an inhuman double whose annoying buzzing presence indicates that she enjoys herself too much at my expense, and whose body I can in turn enjoy in compensation by squishing her. As such, she is essentially an imaginary creature that I cannot help but love and torture for making me suffer. As such, the killing of the fly acknowledges that it represents a good that is inaccessible. The satisfaction gained from killing it is supposed to compensate for the suffering brought by the fly's buzzing presence. It is another way in which man or woman's suffering or jouissance is located in the earth and violently extracted from it in a struggle for the goods and satisfactions. This economy is at the same time also an ecology. They are, as I suggested, at root almost the same word. While ecology may or may not condemn killing flies, it is itself nothing other than a promise to redistribute the world's goods based on knowledge of the world as Vorstellung of good and bad goods, an allocation of resources in which scientific ecological knowledge assumes the force of law. But flies aren't just imaginary, they are also real in every respect, both physical and metaphysical. They are sovereign, indifferent, a numberless horde. They are without lack or fissure, both one and multiple, whose oppressive presence and buzzing clamour for being exceeds thought and the economy of reason, or indeed any other economy in which humans establish an agreement with their environment. Killing flies fails to compensate for anything. There are always more flies. They are an unnumbered multiplicity. On the contrary, the gap opened up between man and fly is incommensurable, even as it pitches on the philosopher's nose, thereby presenting an idea of audacious freedom and impertinent autonomy relative to human knowledge. The buzzing of the fly that resounds long after the death of any particular individual, if we can speak of flies as individuals, resonates from a place heterogeneous to any possible economy of reason or ecology of suffering. Accordingly, it is only from such a position of audacious freedom and impertinent autonomy, recognized in the dissonant music of the fly, I would suggest that speaking beings can begin to address the problem of their relation to the world. And this is, I would suggest, precisely what black metal attempts to do. The most characteristic sound of black metal is the low-res buzzing of guitars propelled like a horde of insects by the clattering body of percussion. It breaks from all previous incarnations of rock and metal to produce a sound in relation to the latter that is singularly dissonant. It is sound that reverberates around a metalhead like a halo of lines, which is a track from Impaled Nazarene's All That We Fear. Halo of Flies starts by evoking the world divested of the symbolic form of authority that is directed in the idea of God as the sum of all fears. The fear of God, which is an essential expression in a certain line of religious thought, a tradition that goes back to Solomon, is the remedy for a world made up of manifold terrors. The fear of God, writes Lacan, is fear of a being who is only able to exercise his cruelty through the evils that are there, multifariously present in life. To have replaced those innumerable fears by the fear of a unique being who has no other means of manifesting his power than through what is feared behind those innumerable fears is quite an achievement. This metaphorical operation, which is for Lacan paternal and in its own way satanic, is also, nevertheless, Lacan emphasizes the principle of wisdom and the foundation of the love of God. This example of the fear of God as paternal metaphor or courting point comes in Seminar 3, otherwise known as the psychoses, where the argument runs that psychosis is indeed the effect of the absence of such a tutoring of a particular signifier over a field of multiple significance. No doubt because they have read their Lacan, the milieu in Impaled Nazarene's All That We Fear is accordingly psychotic. It is a subject in which the subject is schizobound with a world that, since it consists of nothing but multiple fears, is indistinguishable from hell. I quote, "Welcome to your hell, where all fears are reality. Paranoia strikes hard, harder beyond your wildest dreams. Halo of flies over my head. I am decaying Satan's wrath, there to walk planet Earth alone, spreading disease, death, and war." As with much of contemporary black metal, this track locates itself in the space between humanity and its lack of agreement with its environment. In the space of disease, both mental and physical, death and war, a world denuded of all physical and metaphysical comforts, even as it extends the locus of discomfort to the very heavens of the cosmos. Given the name of the band, one can only assume that Impaled Nazarene takes as their point of inspiration the moment of Christ's despair on the cross. The moment where Christ's attempt to embody through sacrifice the summation of all fear and provide the foundation for the love of God fails as Christ's agony opens itself to a God whose cosmic indifference exposes him as so complicit in evil that he dissolves back into the multiple terrors of terrestrial life from whence he came. In Impaled Nazarene's Halo of Flies, planet Earth has been divested of God and therefore become hell, but this hell is equally divested of Satan, whose decaying wrath and rotting corpse give way to the halo of flies that take flight from him as a new figure of transcendent multiplicity. While there are numerous references to flies in the various genres of metal, perhaps since Iron Maiden, the ultimate reference is to Satan, or more properly speaking, Beelzebub, as Lord of the Flies. Or as Malkuth put it, Great Black God, Lord of the Flies. While others here could no doubt help me out with the necessary theological and mystical scholarship, I understand that the term Beelzebub is ultimately a Hebrew insult at the followers of the god Baal, which when pronounced Baal signifies a pile of shit or dung, surrounded by his followers, who are accordingly likened to flies. Dung flies, in fact. From such heterogeneous origins, Beelzebub emerges in the Christian tradition, sometimes as another name for Satan himself, but more interestingly, as his own first lieutenant in the hierarchy of rebel angels. In the demonic hierarchy of Johann Weyer, Dutch physician and demonologist of the 16th century, Beelzebub actually takes the principal position after having staged his own successful infernal rebellion, displacing Satan to second spot, just above Euronymous, in fact, amusingly enough. So clearly, as black metal theorists, this is the demonology that we should follow and take most seriously. So Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, then, is also a figure for the overthrow or overcoming of Satan, and the ascension from some other order, the order of bone flies. So while the reference to Satan and Beelzebub is no doubt primary in the iconology of black metal, the use of the phrase Lord of the Flies, of course, cannot fail, especially from its own kind of ubiquity, to make us think of William Golding's famous novel of the same name. This ubiquity is not, I would think, down to the particular quality of what is, after all, just an English novel, but is down to its use as a pedagogical tool in the British post-war management of the decline and decay of empire. In over 20 years of teaching literature and cultural studies students who have come to Britain from high schools throughout the breadth of the Commonwealth, from Dhaka to Dar es Salaam, from Christchurch, New Zealand, to Kingston, Jamaica, I've failed to find anyone who hasn't read it. Everybody read Lord of the Flies? Yes. Oh, good. There's improvement. That my students had back home successfully absorbed its message of the inherent universal condition of savagery that awaits us all without the benefit of civilization represented by English literature can only be assumed given their presence at great expense in my classroom. That therein they encountered this text again, but this time as an example of Western ideology, annoyed them, with a few exceptions, all the more. Can't say I blame them for that. Anyway, in the novel, the cult of the beast, another name for Satan, of course, is exposed, a key example of the delusion of primitivism and savagery. As at first the rotting corpse is an airman, and then as a decapitated, pullulating peat's head swarming with flies, the sacrificial offering to the beast misperceived as the beast itself. They were black and iridescent green and without number, and in front of Simon, the Lord of the Flies hung on his stick and grinned. There's a quote from Golding. It is in this form that the beast becomes the beast in a different way through the hideous, teeming, acephalic noise of the flies that swarm about its decapitated head. As the beast begins to talk in Golding's novel, the process of self-identification and self-transcendence that holds the God, Satan, man triad together is maintained and sustained in another Christ-like sacrifice. A son unwittingly takes on the beast's mantle and is hunted down and killed, while the other deluded children become savages. In some of the more interesting treatments of the fly motif in black metal, this process is arrested and transformed through parasitic consumption. It is the flies, not the corpse, or the animal's head, or the boy, or all the other substitutes in the chain of sacrifice that make it the beast. A beast that, while black, iridescent, green, and without number, melts into the flesh, into a mephitic trough, a styx of digestive liquid. This is from the Hebron, in which transformed man is dethroned. This is from Phenomenon, or the flies. Phenomenon then, the process of complete post-parasitical transformation, quote, innate insects part of me, parasites inside eating me, host of flies born inside, sees the satanic multiple resurrected from the swarming darkness of base matter, where death has no dominion. Absence of life, I am the Lord of the Flies. The pile of guts was a black blob of flies that buzzed like a saw, writes Golding in his novel, as the dead airman is transformed into his surrounding environment. If knowledge, both human and animal, is, quote, the agreement of the organism and the environment from which it emerges, the black metal buzzsaw resonates as a hail of flies around the central point of non-knowledge encapsulated in a pile of stinking guts, evidence of life without such an agreement, in an amusical sound that exalts in and exacerbates this lack of agreement. Without this knowledge, writes Bataille, without the identity of the organism and without this agreement, life could not be imagined, unquote, even as he tries to imagine it in the form of, quote, the unconsidered flight of the possible into the heart of the impossible that surrounds it, unquote. In black metal's buzzing, its musca and musica, sound takes flight into the heart of the impossible on a vector of amusical existence and Beelzebub's divinely inexistent ascension. Collective and multiple, quote, through compound eyes, I envision eternity, unquote. That's from the Buddha.
We go straight into the next segment, which is strategy. And Stephen isn't Shakespeare. Shakespeare was invoked earlier, but this is the real Shakespeare. His paper is delightfully titled Into the Vomitarium, Diseased Sacraments.
In Aquinas' Summa Theologica, at the culmination of his exploration of the Eucharist, Aquinas raises a number of possible scenarios. For example, quoting Aquinas, it sometimes happens that before or after the consecration, the priest dies or goes mad. It sometimes happens that a fly or a spider or some other poisonous creature falls into the chalice after the consecration. Or even that the priest comes to know that poison has been put in by some evilly disposed person in order to kill him. Further, sometimes too it happens, owing to the priest's want of care, that Christ's blood is spilled, or that he vomits the sacrament received, or that the consecrated hosts are kept so long that they become corrupt, or that they are nibbled by mice, or lost in any manner whatsoever. In the face of this plethora of problems, Aquinas must show that neither God nor the Church command the impossible. When at the end of the Mass the priest staggers out to vomit the infected host, this is a continuation of the sacrament, not just denial. Such a suggestion would of course be anathema to Aquinas, for whom the propriety of the Incarnation can only be upheld if it does not in any way compromise the simplicity, immutability, and impassibility of God. God does not, cannot suffer or be changed as a result of the Incarnation, but that would be a contradiction in terms of the God whose essence is pure act. Similarly, the consecration of bread and wine so that it's changed into the body and blood of Christ implies no fragility in the divine. If wine is spilled, then the offending matter is burned. If the host is corrupted by mould, it is kept and venerated until the outward semblance of bread has rotted away, at which point it can be disposed of. The implication is that there is an intimacy between divine substance and material accident, and that certain acts of destruction or allowing decay to spread are an appropriate way to preserve sacramental purity. However, it's hard for Aquinas to avoid a Gnostic dissimulation in which, as the bread and wine are not real bread and wine, so the flesh of Christ is not real flesh, but only a semblance. In analysing the Eucharistic elements, Aquinas claims that, quote, it's evident to sense that all the accidents of the bread and wine remain after the consecration, and this is reasonably done by divine providence. First of all, because it is not customary, but horrible, for men to eat human flesh and to drink blood. In other words, beneath the accident of customary eating, a horror is truly inactive, and one that must be dissimulated. The substance of this horror is the consumption of a body that by its nature should remain undefiled and incorrupt. When discussing the resurrection of Christ, Aquinas affirms that it is a true and entire body that is raised. But this is flesh understood according to its substance, not according to its corruption. Anything which corrupts the flesh, including the effects of humours such as phlegm and bile, is removed or restrained by divine power. Strange tension emerges here. The Eucharistic elements are truly Christ by having their material substance removed and replaced by the divine. But the body of Christ must retain its fleshy substance whilst being held in purity by divine force. Christ is disseminated under the appearance of corruption, whilst his own flesh is preserved as incorrupt. And such reflections provoke us to think further on the nature of the Incarnation and of kenosis, the self-emptying of God in Christ, in which, according to Philippians, Christ took the form of a slave. To what extent is God in Christ subject to fragility, to dispersal and corruption. To what extent do the divine and fleshly substances communicate with one another? Where flesh is infused with glory, the spirit effectively decays. It's the essence of goodness that it communicates itself, according to Aquinas. And this makes it fitting that God should be incarnate, should take fleshly human nature to himself. It's necessary that this is done truthfully, that the body should be subject to change and suffering, hunger and thirst. And we can truly say that Christ suffers because there is one underlying suppositum or hypostasis. Christ is not two persons. However, we still have to take care to predicate different attributes in different respects. When we say Christ hungers or suffers, we are truly predicating Godhead, but only in respect to his human nature. The divine nature remains unaffected by any of this. It neither changes nor suffers, nor is divided as a result of anything that Christ does or undergoes. Here at the extreme limit of the possible, we draw back. The goodness that communicates itself is compelled to use sacraments, sensible signs which make present spiritual realities. In a word, to be seen. But what if scattering and decay were not just the accidental trappings of an unsullied word, but the condition of that word's possibility? If so, they would also be the condition of its impossibility, the ruin of the word. The sign always stands above a rupture that's internal to its very constitution as a sign, between the ideality of a gathered meaning and the temporal slippage that follows it out each time it is performed, between the wounded singularity of its origin and the automated anonymity of its repetition. On this reading, the logic of incarnation and kenosis is therefore that all sacraments are diseased sacraments, all chalices are poisoned gifts. The vomiting priest is not merely a representative of defect or sacrilege, but of a witness to what must always remain unassimilated in communication, offering a corrupt, bile-filled prayer to the impossible itself. And the impossible concerns a God who not only dies but decomposes, the vertiginous decomposition of all totality. The God who decomposes is the God who finds divine stasis and impassibility too lukewarm, too tepid to his taste. A God who renounces himself, who says to himself, because you are neither hot nor cold, I vomit you out of my mouth. This discomforting kenosis worms its way into the heart of the disavowed dark ground of God. Whilst Aquinas' concerns might seem a world apart from those of black metal, in truth the latter has built much of its iconography and lyrical imagery around an inversion of Christianity, and the figure of the incarnate God has been the most obvious target for hate, contempt and defilement. Whilst there might be some truth in the criticism that this makes satanic black metal parasitic upon the Christianity it rejects, I want to avoid such stereotypical reductions by thinking kenosis with black metal, and specifically with the work of Death Spell Onega. In their early releases, Infernal Battles and Inquisitive of Satan, we find an almost parodic celebration of evil and joy in suffering inflicted upon the weak. The negativity of this rage can't be lightly dismissed, but it's undermined by its failure to let go of its dependence upon a totalizing force, a sacred power that is inevitably figured patriarchal. Imagery of rape is frequent in these songs, from the title Raping Human Dignity to the lyrics from The Ancient Presence Revealed. Quote, once a woman of incredible beauty fell in love and thought she could awaken human feelings in the ice-cold void that is your heart. You raped her and let your war dog bite her cup to blood. Plucked by your sword, impaled on your spear, her corpse drops to the high peak of your tower. In Torture and Death, we hear that, quote, the child beater, the women raper, I'm the one that orders and commands you. In Desecration Master, usually using rape for female creatures, I ejaculate inside the dead body. Now, in quoting these passages, I'm aware of the simplistic way in which critics of heavy metal in general draw a direct association between images of violence in lyrics and violent acts in reality. However, my point is different and would require more careful analysis given time. It's that the misogynistic imagery here betrays the conservatism of this form of black metal, its inability to think beyond an evil which is a form of sacralized rape in the name of a presence, a master, in other words, a God. There is no real critique, no liberating anarchy, no evacuation of the ground here. The God who justifies domestic violence, child abuse is simply dressed in black. But this is far from the end of the story. As Death Spell Omega's sound evolves towards a twisted cacophonous dissonance, so their lyrics become more discursive and more obviously modelled on scriptural, confessional and liturgical sources. This is not the banal parasitism of a mimicry disguised as opposition, but a more furtive and fertile parasitism, which nests itself in the heart of Christian sacramental and theological imagery in order to expose its corruption. The notes and chords themselves are tortured and cleared, and words spew forth in an obsessive guttural declamation of their own inadequacy. I'm concerned here with two releases in particular, Penose from 2005 and Diabolicus Absconditus from 2011. In the former, the opening lyrics are as follows. Was there not an inconceivable loss of knowledge at Bethlehem? Christ's abasement, his subjecting himself to the laws of human birth and growth and to the lowliness of fallen human nature. Did the Son remain the transcendent Logos? Is there not a radical and fatal discontinuity between the consciousness of the transcendent Logos and the secular Jesus? The question form is significant, I think. Here the theological edifice is not simply pelted from the outside, but made to tremble according to its own logic. The incarnation becomes a kind of vomiting out of the Godhead, a nauseating fall into decomposition. Obedience to the point of death, falling down through increasing pressure into the death-like region of ooze and slime and decay. These are the fruits and symptoms of the abasement of the Word, the assumption of humanity and the simultaneous occultation of divinity. Ooze, slime and decay become the sensible means by which God is both communicated and hidden, but they're not merely external vessels for a purified inner meaning. As the music itself slides and veers, it becomes the corrupt sacrament of a corrupt God, an oral translation of a deity of decay. Small wonder that the lyrics continue kenosis, O theory of great peril. Whereas Aquinas attempts to provide an incarnation in which God risks nothing, this blackened kenosis puts divinity itself in peril. And yet something remains, something is still given unconditionally in this abasement. Another quote. Rob God of any attribute, and fill the shattering universe with a pestilent sense of putrefaction and the glorious cloud of death, for steadfast at any cost he must be. We might recall how Maimonides insisted that God could not have any attributes, because to attribute anything to God would imply a division between divine essence and divine qualities, and so compromise the simplicity of God. Here, however, attribution is not withheld to preserve God's negative purity, but is stolen away in order to release God into putrefaction, into the glory of an expenditure without return. Such language, of course, recalls Bataille, and it's striking that Diabolicus Absconditus uses heavily his pseudonymous work, Madame Eduarda, from which this quote was produced in full in lyrics. She was seated, Madame Eduarda. She held one leg stuck up in the air to open her crack. Yet wider, she used her fingers to draw the folds of skin apart. And so her old rag and ruin lowered at me, hairy and pink, just as full of life as some loathsome squid. Why? I stammered in a subdued tone. Why I refuse her? You can speak for yourself, she said. I'm God. No use laying it all up to irony when I say of her that she is God, but God figured as a public whore and gone crazy. That viewed through the optic of philosophy makes no sense at all. The narrator of the work is Pierre Angelique, the angelic seeker, or the angelic rock. The theophany occurs in a brothel, and later again as Pierre follows Madame Eduarda through the streets. Bataille's themes of eroticism and excess are at work here, but in a kind of incarnate or sacramental register. Pierre is both exalted and anguished by the experience, which for him lies not in the sexual acts, but in a voyeuristic vision. His gaze meets first Madame Eduarda's exposed vagina, loathsomely alive, and secondly it sees her as an unremitting absence. In a passage from the work not quoted by Desmond Onega, Pierre writes, She was entirely black, simply there, as distressing as an emptiness, a hole. She had not lied, she was God. Her presence had about it the unintelligible out-and-out simplicity of a stone, right in the middle of the city, and had the feeling of being in the mountains at night time, lost in a lifeless, hollow solitude. I felt that I was free of her. I was alone, as if face to face with black rock. And this experience is a coincidence of opposites, of lurid light and blank black organic rock. God and the whore meet at this extreme limit, where the demarcations and utility of regulated life break down. God is known only from God, Despel said, and therefore as the ruin of human cognition. But this is also the promise of an inhuman glory, encountered in horror and impurity. For, quote, God is nothing if he is not in every sense the surpassing of God. And diabolical. This sacramental aspect of this is suggested also in Kenosis. Quote, the fruit that is forbidden holds the greatest potential for providing infinite knowledge. Spiritual incest and the defilement of the temple of the Holy Spirit, ritualized and immanent. God made immanent, ritually defiled, a whole in being. For Despel Omega, there is little to distinguish the Deus absconditus from the Diabolicus absconditus. One ecstatic torment of being is at play in the multiplicity of failing names. And despite what might be suggested about the continuing patriarchal voyeurism of Pierre Angelique, Despel's embrace of Kenosis and the God who is a whore point beyond the derivative misogyny of their earlier work. They invoke a queering with God and Satan, embodied equally in rag and ruin and the hollow blankness of black rock. It's striking then that one of the pioneers of queer theology, Marcella Althaus-Reid, draws heavily on Madame Edouarda in her book The Queer God. Althaus-Reid rejects the colonial, imperial and heterosexist God of Christian orthodoxy and calls for a theology constructed from the sexual lives of the marginal. This will be a theology in which God speaks through unruly bodies, unheard of combinations, quote, a theology which aims, as only queer theology can, to scandalize, that is, to be a stone in the road, to force theologians to stop, fall down, while pausing in their pain and thinking during the pause. The stone, becomes a stone of stumbling, not a rock on which to build a church. For Althaus-Reid, this will lead to the unravelling of a God in exile, a shadow God, experienced in the horror and impurity which Bataille addressed. In a queer kenosis, God will no longer coincide with God's self. God will be multiple, orgiastic. But kenosis is God's emergence from the closet of divine status. Quote, a queer kenosis may then consist in engaging with God as part of a theological project which aims to lead God astray. That is, facilitating God's own disempowering acts, but without presuming to know what original power is there to let go. A truly incarnate God is handed over to material construction, to a necessary defilement of essence. This must be what Althaus-Reid calls an antichrist, for it dissolves the stable identity of Christ, his dyadic nature becoming multiple and scattering in, quote, a disemboweling of the Trinity. In Madame Edouarda, we see the decoupling of God from the endless cycle of utility and reproduction and identified with what Althaus-Reid calls a corporeal liturgical sexual gesture, or, quote, God depends upon our experiences of pleasure and despair and intimacy to manifest God's self. Althaus-Reid remains Christian, but in a queer sense. For her, faithfulness means practicing a demonology, an embodiment of rebellious spirits, in which hell is welcome as a refusal of repressive colonial normative offers of redemption. Like God, like the whore, the queer Christian refuses the new imposed identity and remains stubbornly what she has become. Christ and Antichrist meet in unheard of perverse combinations, each refusing the unholy alliance of sanctity and rape, whether its representatives carry a cross or a trident. Elsewhere, Althaus-Reid writes of, quote, a Eucharist in which Christ's transubstantiation depends on a discarded piece of rotten bread. Against a theology which advocates what she calls a God ideal, outside failures and platters of destitution, the sacrament communicates grace in and through the abject, spewed out failure of God, a God fully subject to the accidental rotting and longing of the flesh. In this coupling of Des Philomega with queer theology, there is neither echo nor reversal, but intimate putrefying communicatio idiomatum. This is not without risk for either party. Queer theology must reckon with the violence of excess, the violence which underlies romanticised figures of whores and drag queens. It must also face the other aspect of Bataille's vision, to which black metal gives voice, that repressive, misanthropic blankness of the black rock, which is the second phase of Madame Eduarda's revelation. For their part, Des Philomega, a challenge to work out a concept and sound of sovereignty, which is not a mere replica of ecclesial and political mastery, but which, paraphrasing Albert Reed, is sovereign in its freedom to fail, and to do so in demonically queer solidarity with its destitute. So, let us break bread and raise a cup to sovereign Kenosis, an emptying out without reserve and the torment and ecstasy of unknowing. Some words from Kenosis. Thou shalt bring us the chalice of divine wrath and final consummation to thy lips, and drink with confidence. Tell me, sweet child, why are tears rolling in your eyes?
Thanks, Stephen. The next presentation is another astral projection. Ben Woodard is in London, Ontario, in Canada, but he has sent a video which we'll hear the audio of, and it's entitled Folding a Cadaverous Scream, the Disharmonious Flesh of Recombinant Horror. We'll go with this in the future. We're going to skip. Can people hear it?
Yeah.
You sure?
Lower the volume just a little bit.
Okay, we'll try again then.
Looking up the slides.
Unfortunately, Spinoza's phrase, cited by the Ruse, "We still don't know what a body can do," can be taken as a jokingly prophetic account of recombinant horror. The self-explosion and self-expansion of the organs, a terrible outfolding of the body, an upchuck of putrid becoming, and nidus bloom. Spinoza wouldn't want to imagine such self-vivisection splendor, a form of horror aesthetic and or method which immediately stitches together at least two philosophical issues. One, any body that we know is an option of the actuality of sedimentary processes, and the ongoing or less slow processes which complement it. The body of recombinant core is a body with and without organs. Potentiality organized in a seemingly dead meat sac, a labyrinthine corpse. 2. The work of this sickly vital potentiality appears at odds with the structural sedimentation of thought as reason. The generative expulsions of the biological upsets the architectural structure of pleasant cognition. These two issues appear sewn together, rejecting one another as the back graph. Towards the end of Kant's critique of pure reason, where the ruins and buildings of the mind are troubled by the maggots of microorganisms depending on the translation of the biological nature of generation. But Kant is characteristically unwilling to fall for man either side, seemingly in its dissension. Psychologically and affectively, I will run against the phenomenological positivity often taken to be inseparable from any theoretical explosion of life, such as Michel Henry, Deleuze, Bergson, who equate life that arises from energetic, follows visceral nature in general, with positivity, with the givenness or becoming of life, or becoming of being, but always for our happiness. I wish to combat this by counter-discussion and not direct engagement. In a broad, universalist sense, I want to connect black metal and organic teaming as a non-construct which pulls out the mouth, the great laceration of the intestine, which howls against the gradient of its function and openness to the outside. Blackness from noise to music becomes the interruption of the transcendental anatomy in the immanent body, the body of common horror. In his essay Biophilosophy of the 21st Century, Eugene Thacker articulates the bizarre spatiality of discourses on life.
Can people actually hear this? Do you want to continue with this? Yeah?
Which utilize the practice of boundaries of reconciliation. By this practice he means that in thinking life there is an inward turning and an outward turning. The former divides, orders, and interrelates species and types, and is metabolic as well as, quote, the organization of the organs, among other things. The latter, the outward turning, manages boundaries against the non-living, and makes instrumentality possible in immunological and maintains exchanges. How does recombinant ore exporting a great labyrinthine mass upon these organs of vestigial extensity, as having the body to pre-human tall and tyrant organs turn in and turn out? A certain cinematic outwardness is relief against which excessive organ using appears, that of Cronenberg's great plastic skin, the closest filmic equivalent to Jean-François Lyotard's great skin, where the pungent productivity of the corpse is still some kind of whole, as celebrated by Baudelaire, Rotting in the Sun, or Clark Ashton Smith's supernumerary corpse refused to decay. Body horror, bio-horror, raises the biological its flow in a romantic or mature philosophical sense, is a broken up image of the human body in a positive sense. Showing, another metric philosophically, was somewhere in the middle as text and transcendental anatomy show. Showing this diseased eye in the first outline, as independent from the integrated animal organism, for instance, vitalized disease itself. It is not hard to imagine a free flow of unbound organs, an intestinous geyser wherein all the clusters of life have a diseased life, which can no longer be properly organized. The inward expression of the grotesque of Bataille's wearing big toe, the inversion of a strange porno murderous rage out of the eye, the penile eye, the eye gorge of the sadistic victims of the sun, when you just stab at Aristotle's Cyclopean eye, the non-exuberant surgeon of metaphysics. It is eventually to follow science into the human creature as erection with free hands and being upright. But somehow we think we have stopped at our head. For the tie, science comes out of the man's head, but the head comes out of science. It tears flesh to open an eye, the head is lost. The pattern of free flowing into the biological totem is exactly as grotesquely taken up in John Carpenter's The Thing. However, becoming of eminence yet segmented, particularly in the Bugatti fucking kidding mind. Transcendental and productive of body mass, yet archetypal in its process of cloning, when disrupted by a different level of eminence, the electric eminence in Rita Bush's biology. The spark which enlivens the organ solid known as Frankenstein's monster undoubtedly flows from the coherency of the thing, or the laser beam from Akira, which starts the flesh compactor of grotesque cosmic infant with all of Juliet's skin. But for all of Akira's nuclear disregard for architecture, all building is beating towards rubble, the fascination of the labyrinthine returns with a vengeance. Tetsuo's body demonstrates the heterogeneity of the organs falling dinosauriated against architecture, and the fact that matter is subordinate, even when organized into the organs. There is always some gross thing, still in a rude hollow without central, the architectonic premise line. The image of the organs means that the archetypal cells of life merely give more possibilities for twisting, for forming an even more layered maze. Again, following hallway. Human beings have a labyrinthine structure. The labyrinth is the structure of existence because existence is unthinkable without language. Where in other senses is labyrinth because of words and being swept away together. We live in a horror of the distinction of the labyrinth, the non-choice of inside-outside, and philosophy of Google haunting the rooms and glance of it, alongside the pathetic secret of life as an embodied from living nature, a disembodied head supported by a length of neck on which it folds itself like a snail. With the labyrinth and the snail, it is near impossible to not dive into Junji Ito's Uzumaki books, of the spiral of steps and the appearance of oddly spiraling phenomena contorting bodies and causing widespread insanity. That is, there is no clear distinction between transcendence and immanence, to think it, but enough to sense it, to see the difference between the ruins and the slime, and to be pinched by it at each end and twisted to a bone-snapping, flesh-tearing opening straight. Still, it seems the labyrinthine cannot be pulled away from the inorganic, from the putrefying thesis of pattern which injects itself imperfectly into the vesicle to the wriggling spit water, the earliest form of life. Yet inorganicity, infecting the excessive biologicals when a rough obstacle to decay. Stanislavski's paintings capture this particularity well. If working at this kind of all old life, beyond rot that is somehow held together in its dust beam, a carnival of old witches and two mummies too old to even move, non-self-destructively caught between the Baroque and the Gothic. Those high limits that animals can no longer be aggregates, at least biologically, something we retain in the social, but this gives us a crowd as disease vector. You can step behind coach narrator of the man in the crowd, who sees himself thinking as clearly as Leibniz, looking at the crowd outside his window in their aggregate relations, focusing on one particular monad person, for no obvious reason. The uneveness between the aggregate and the non-aggregate festers and leaves this chain, but in a kind of opposite sense here. Instead of worrying where the tiny vortices or voids may be because of compactness, here the transcendental anatomical or stick eminence of the tie is a stretching to the breaking point. But most of the familiar images of the flesh, not the viscera. The faces of Hellraiser Cenobites, or the classic surgeon Colton escape from LA, the Lewis tries to keep the peace in the fold, keeping the windows of the monad as a Baroque house. But as never Stani points out in Architecture Decay, the Umwe, the twisting of construction, necessitates that solid light void. There is no use for Deleuze's gentle flying open of the monadic window. The inorganic is the ground of the horrifying twist of the organic, wonderfully and hyperbolically illustrated by the Dead Space games, in which a massive marker found in a dead planetoid unleashes a signal, a code, which produces an outbreak of necromorphs, life forms which animate the dead in such a way that destruction of the biological center is not enough. One must utilize a terroristic dieback strategy, removing the limbs and annihilating their mobility. Classic Kierkegaard, there is no quiet in the grave, but only a teeming of organisms, fictional, and not doing their corpse work. The signal of the music of the science fiction of deep space, the cosmological high note of Schopenhauer's deep bass tone. The musical form is destroying the body. We can pervert Schelling's use of the flute player rearranging the stones with the flute player, Schopenhauer's comment with uncharacteristic instrument, forming a pile of organs, disembodied hearts flopping about on their ventricles and bouncing on their valves. The common horror perfectly packages the horrendousness of viscera only to unfold it outward, to splice life's productivity with its sickliness like meat wrapped in butcher paper that when unwrapped blooms into more meat, a carried on decay. God is just another outcropping of the head, a great mistake as Ligotti puts it, either the transcendental architecture or the immanence of biological. We here we're applying into in transcendental anatomy and in black metal. If architecture goes in use according to Schelling, the organs are the lively unfreezing of the structural arctic. A music that turned on itself, hence the labyrinth of the ears overdone, baked through labyrinthitis, while this was the inner ear, twisting one's perception, a great vertigo. Eminence is twisted by the transcendental outside because this transcendence is beyond the sun, we have flown away from it in darkness. This vertigo, as well as infolding and outfolding, look for a Cyrillic double vertigo. The double vertigo of infinity which dissolves all meaning, which he ties to music as that which dissolves all form. It isn't music where the reminder of form's incessantness. Isn't this what separates music, even chaotic, disaster, harsh music, from noise? Note is a form of music, as opposed to noise which cannot be cognitively resolved, is that which has some principle of individuation in a negative sense. Its generative immanence is patterned out in a universalist way, but a way in which one can have so many different consequences in the flesh and blood. The incomprehensibility of the black metal howl is simultaneously the inorganic pulsations of the cosmological and the burping up of leather from the rise overthinking plant erections known as human beings. The opening scene of the game Parasite Eve couples operatic musical and inferno of overlooked mitochondria, soon followed by more and more drastic mutations, and altogether different normalization of the sun and that of the penile eye. And so, the dark chemical facilities as a process of music, of mass flute playing, how the street emerges from the massive, how the teens Nick Land describes the body as an organ as a transcendental desert of immanence. So we take black metal as biological alpha negretto, who always already too much is a non-glorious immanence. Where the disgusting and unmiraculous happening of the biological is the material resistance of archetypes, or platonic genes in a soup of numerous material mediums powered by trajectories far beyond the purview of any particular actuality. Black metal on the whole, in its self-demolishing utilization of the lyric, the head attempting to direct the force-resistant relation of life that is unfortunately self-aware, which through the howl of the scream, index the dematerializing effect of the non-biological force, but one distinct from the musical clutter which is the inorganic drone and the organic pseudo-insectogenetic from the guitar growl, as in louder tones. This takes us back to the ruins of Kant Central, the Saturday crawling head, the ghoul, the necromorph, the thing. If a musical force attempts to reaffirm our aggregate status posse of the tie, is black metal which also opens up the throat of the tie's esoteric man. Illustrating this, we call that horror holds the body by way of a transcendental injection which is already present, and the fact that biological came from the non-biological. It is recapitulated by Kant and architectonic. It becomes the structure of that recapitulation by thought instead of thought possibility and its limit. The vital materials in which simultaneously of life, to upset the scene of ratiocination in the double sense, to force up life's generosity, and in the present moment, challenging any instance of categorization, as well as highlighting the nervous fact that thought is past into squishy materiality. Music such as that of Louder Tones reduces the ghoul to the head inching along, trying to make its way back to the tie's acephalus, an acephalus which is screaming at the top of its chemical black lungs, folding inward and outward through its openness to the outside, always threatening to make all its functions defeated.
That was weird. I'll ask Ben if he can upload the video to the blog or even the text. So we can hopefully see the images as well. Our last presentation for this section is Vincent Connell. If you look around the wall, you can see that Vincent's artwork and community icons artwork are being simultaneously. Vincent is going to talk us through some of his text pieces. His presentation is called Tune In, Turn On, Curse Out.
Very excited to be here. This is a slightly different context that I'm used to for speaking, so it's a lot of fun for me. So the artwork and imagery that I've provided to promote this, the third Black Metal Theory Symposium, is from a series of 23 works based on ancient depictiones, or curse tablets, which apply an invocation, for good or ill, toward another party, most often with whom you are either besotted or who has wronged you in some matter of business or personal relations. So, in speaking about the works in this hex series, we will summarize the traditional role of the curse tablet and how these particular works are constructed in order to achieve similar results through a structural analysis and an exploration of their material properties as they relate to Hermetic tradition. This will then allow us to move beyond the physical object of power and discuss intention and the psychology of belief as an entity in its own right, which leads directly into the overarching theme of text. One's complicity with the complex and layered structure that is belief is such that when encountering the intentions of another, it ultimately challenges the insular domain of their very being, destroying the barrier of the self and forcing an engagement with the realm of another. So this then turns virtually all human interaction into a psychic attack being perpetrated by and upon everyone at all times. Existence, as we will come to understand, is a relentless barrage of intentions, ideas, and to fulfill its purpose, to cause aspect upon a receiver. So, with this in mind, what do you want, and how are you going to get it? Seemingly simple, this very basic question provides a window into the true genius and true brutality that comprises our psychology. The ability to channel our desires into a defined trajectory, either directly toward an individual or more covertly through the use of something else. So, curse tablets have long embodied that something else. These objects become a physical manifestation of your desire, a device of storage and amplification for your craving, and a conduit to carry that message from one consciousness to another. Existing in the space between the desirous and the desired, to channel the wanton energies of an individual and translate these intentions through a corporeal form into the spiritual is where it all comes to fruition. That spiritual form is then granted the capacity to move through the visible world in a way the aspiring body cannot. Tapping into the unseen undercurrents of our visible reality and harnessing the elusive powers of another space or time. So, as objects of power, straddling multiple realms, these curse tablets have been used as far back as the 5th century BC, creating opportunities for the people of the ancient world to affect their surroundings and status. Many of these objects were inscribed upon lead, which is held in high regard by the alchemists for being both extremely malleable and resistant to corrosion. Often rolled or folded and bound, they would then be punctured and either nailed onto or buried at the door of the person to which you were hoping to affect. The series of hex drawings, while taking their name from the Germanic root for witch, in order to make reference to the physical art object as either the originator or the amplifier of this affect, are meant to evoke the same resonance of influence upon the inhabitants of the world, room, or gallery in which they are placed. Consistent with their predecessors, they've each been inscribed with their own invocation in graphite, which is chemically understood as a subsidiary of carbon, along with diamond and coal. The graphite, being a mineral, was also called black lead, and could at times be confused with the actual metal element of lead. And this transposition of the mineral with the properties of lead leads to the interchangeable reference that we have with the lead pencil that we continue to kind of bastardize today. So lead is a ruler of the dark and lusterless prima materia, and therefore these invocations are both directly connected to the very origin of the universe and are also highly resilient in order to withstand the ravages of space and time, so that they may carry out their function. The particular inscriptions embedded within these hex works have each been hidden, obscured, shrouded by a layer of carbon paper. Used in this case as an amplifier of purpose, given that carbon itself is both one of the most abundant elements in the universe, as well as the foundation of all known life forms. So this allows the invocation to be channeled through a shared physical property. This shield of obfuscation, the carbon, is punctured so as to allow the intentions hidden underneath to freely flow through the object of power and into the same space occupied by the viewer, thus creating affect upon them in their surroundings. So I'm sure you can all feel that coming from these items in the room. Now, with this as the material composition of these objects and drawings and their relation to numinous powers, we need to explore the veritable minefield that is intent and belief. The curse trade was quite lucrative to many an ancient psychopath, able to tap into the mystical reservoir of power and archetypal myths lying in repose, bridging the realm of one party's objective and another's worldview. This intention is meant to infect the deepest realms of one's belief structure. To dig into another's psyche and physically project your desire within their being is ostensibly the function of these objects. They weave through the stratified collective unconscious and access a primal area of individuality, one's very personhood. Their understanding of who and what they are becomes fundamentally challenged by the placing of another's intent within the sphere of their own selfhood. So this action, likened to a psychic attack upon the other, is so much more than just a function of the curse tablet, but is in fact the very nature of virtually all human interaction, where the insular domain of one's subjective consciousness is threatened by the interlocution of another perspective on reality, both internal and external. Consider that in order to exist in this world amidst other people, objects, ideas, one must learn to tune out certain background noise while tuning into the things upon which their focus has been attenuated. If that weren't the case, places like Times Square or Piccadilly Circus, even the city of Las Vegas, couldn't really exist in the same world with us. Our simple minds would be overrun with sensory input and shut down or just be driven to abject madness. Unfortunately, being human, we're subject to a complete and utter lack of objectivity. Our individual consciousness prevents us from approaching any and every object, person, or idea as a whole thing, without being informed by each of our own individual paths. So while there are certainly shared and overlapping experiences and cultural legacies, there is still just so damn much input being driven through our individual sense organs that any real collective experience is still heavily biased or set. You're listening or eventually reading, streaming of this talk, this discussion here. That's what this is about. It's the same thing. This is fundamentally an attack upon the domain that is your individual collective consciousness, and that then makes me the pest, subjecting you all to my fucking will. So, in much the same way, the existential realm of black metal is another form of perfect vehicle to relay the same type of influence upon its listener. Black metal develops an intention of affect by conveying its message through the physical vibrations of sound, which are then unconcerned with an overall clarity of distinction, and in fact can go to great length at times to keep its musicality obscured or enshrouded by a veil of underproduction. So in this way, the collective force of a black metal band serves a very similar function as the curse tablet or the hex drawing by amplifying an intention and infusing that into the listener through the object of songcraft and albumization, making present in the mind of the receiver these incantations of the void, the absence of existence, hope, or purpose for the physical body, thus divining a separation of one's mind and consciousness and their physical form. Thus divining a separation of one's mind and consciousness and the physical form of ourselves and our known world. Black metal, more so than any other subgenre of extreme music, lends itself to this psychic attack so well due to both its inherent physical structure and its existential themes. Like the early rejection of Christian dogma and its inverted binary mirroring within the Norwegian Genesis, black metal pulls from one subconscious space to infuse its sound, which is then unleashed upon the psyche of the listener. Black metal, with its occult roots, conjures its own manifest destiny of ideological warfare upon the existent baggage of your most intimate self-net, pulling you into an interaction with it, regardless of whether that engagement ends up with both parties in agreement. So these psyches that we've each got and we've each grown so fond of, the hidden architecture that we can't find a tangible presence for in the physical organ of the brain, then become the repository of our memories, past influence, and history. Deep in the psyche of the Norwegians, who were to become church-burning black metal fiends, resides a path which predated Christian enslavement and included a whole other set of thoughts and beliefs. This ancient repository is the black, decaying corpse of their shared past and shared beliefs. This miasma is a collective pool into which the black metal plunges its desire, transforming it into an intentionality, which is then directed through their songs and into your being. Just as the curse tablets and hex drawings pull from the same sub-psychic space and cultural legacy, they are then tuned in to the background radiation of the universe. This is a river of dark matter buried in all of our collective minds, flowing with the shared mythologies being experienced by mankind since the beginning of time, and it's just waiting for one of these objects to be switched on and focused towards an individual consciousness in order to subject it to its blissful command. So it is through the power of these external objects, the curse tablet, the hex drawing, the black metal, compounded with everything else that we may come into contact with, that we draw back the curtain, revealing the frailty and savagery of this human existence. Through our engagement of something other than, we discover our true identity. Not in a national or a cultural regard, but in our proper human form. To engage, subject, and infect is the grand function of humanity. It is through a complicit acceptance of our human limitations, physical and mental, that we are able to then allow for this dominion over ourselves, or consequently, to dominate another through the crushing oppression of belief.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Please do take the time to look at Vincent's curse tablets that displayed on the wall. There are 7, I think, over 23. And also Camellia Icons as well. And also check out Vincent's website, which is amazing, Black Laboratory of Vincent. We're going to take a break now until 6 and then come back for the last 2 presentations. So please stretch your legs, use the bathroom, have a drink, and chat to one another. And we'll be back at 6.
I'm all off my no discussion.
Yeah, it is very inspiring.
We're going straight into you. But
Okay. The final session. We finally reached the T for Tristan. Two presentations to complete the symposium. Our first venture in this last session is Dermot Hester. His title is The Hopeless Soul Keeps Mating. Notes on Black Metal and Contemporary Fiction.
Thank you, Karen and Michael and Nicola, for inviting me to speak about black metal, or perhaps to speak like Nicola about black metal and writing, how black metal suffuses writing. It courses into its cadences and its intonation, its characters, plot. There's something amiss here. This tryst. It's a struggle. It doesn't, what's the word? The blast beat kind of excoriates. Matthew Simmons' The Moon Tonight Feels My Revenge offers short stories inspired by one-man black metal bands, Burzum, Stríborg, Wrath of the Weak. Their subjects reverberate, I think, with certain forms of black metal we have been discussing here today. The protagonist of a story called Sleep Underground seeks, in his nightly subterranean hibernation, deep in the soil, silence, sanctuary from summer heat and summer sweat, shelter from the world, the city, the sunshine, the warmth, temporary cubicle work. Yet, quote, dirt is cool, he would prefer not to sweat. They live in a city that is hot and wet for far too long every year. She loves it, but he would prefer to wind his body around the roots of a favorite tree and spend the season living off stored body fat, with her entwined. His partner doesn't really get it. She wants him to talk, clean the mud out of the shower after he's finished, recycle the recyclables, compost the compostables. That is, participate, be social. He wants to dig into the earth and stay there, peaceful and remote. There is Manafic too, of one-man black metal band Zastur. He spends 19 to 20 hours a day asleep in his basement. He owns a 3-story house, but he has never been to the upper floors. A thin layer of dust covers everything up there while he's underground making black metal. There is Sin Nana, who makes black metal under the name Stríborg, who lives alone in a treehouse in Tasmania. Quote, Sin Nana likes the moon. Everything there is grey and quiet and dead and spinning. He likes to dig his feet into the dirt, bury himself to his ankles, and he likes to wait to see what happens. He is waiting to take root. Yet here, black metal doesn't merely dictate theme. Formal construction and stylistic fabric are likewise afflicted. Rhythm unfolds at a deliberate yet diminishing pace. Characters shrink from the observer, flicker, and disappear. Language, lapidary, almost whispers, induces a kind of minimal affective response. Reading The Moon Tonight Feels My Revenge feels almost like an intrusion upon some carefully crafted privation. We read in a story called Wrath of the Weak, quote, "He wants no one to touch nothing or anything. He wants someone to touch nothing or none of anything. He wants you to touch nothing of his. Yours, yes, not his. Nothing, not anything." The Deleuzian Roland Bogue, in his essay Violence in Three Shades of Metal, Death, Doom and Black, attempts to provide an encounter between black metal and the writing of Deleuze and Guattari, which, on first impressions, yield very different results to the experiments of Simmons. According to Bogue, black metal corresponds to a body without organs in its negotiation between ecstatic, apersonal, affective intensities and a thirst for self-annihilation. It is also, he claims, contiguous with Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the war machine, a mutative, chaotic force of transformation focused on the perilous relation between ecstatic deterritorialization and suicidal or fascistic annihilation. Black metal is also conjoined here with nomadism, the refrain, smooth space, the time of eon, planes of consistency, and the virtual. Each successive conjunction another attempt to amplify and extend the resonance of this encounter between black metal and the Deleuze-Guattarian corpus. Yet as black metal is increasingly enveloped by Deleuze and Guattari in this text and made to communicate more intimately with their conceptual framework, stutters and hesitations issue from the text, and the space occupied by Bogue's argument is evidently reduced, decimated. Concepts fail to form lasting textual combinations with black metal, quickly losing traction, substituted by another, beginning the process anew. The nomadic follows the war machine, which followed the body without organs, which followed the smooth space, which followed the virtual. Finally, denuded of its conceptual mystification, the stakes of Bogue's conjunction of black metal and Deleuze-Guattarian philosophy become starkly banal. Thus we read, quote, "The final ethical measure of any music is its ability to create new possibilities for life, and such is the measure that must be applied to an assessment of the social practices within which death metal, doom metal, and black metal music and lyrics are given concrete actualization. Deleuzian ethics, upon which this smug expression of vitalist prejudice reclines, is thus inadvertently contaminated by implication, and must therefore become another vector of our analysis. So for Deleuze, a body, like microbes or the atmosphere, or a text, is made up of a specific relation between particles and a concomitant capacity for affecting or being affected. When bodies meet, a number of aspects emerge, most notably agreement or disagreement. Quote, "When a body encounters another body, or an idea another idea, it happens that the two relations sometimes combine to form a more powerful whole, and sometimes one decomposes the other, destroying the cohesion of its parts. So, bodies that agree combine to form a greater relation with more affective capacity, and thus a higher degree of power. For example, in the agreeable encounter between the human body and food, the nutrient relation combines productively with the digestive relation. Bodies that disagree, however, can corrode one another. Their relations conflict, and one or both bodies' relations are decomposed and weakened, bringing forth lapses, calcifications, lacunae. Take, for instance, the relation between poison and the body. Boysen's relation clashes with certain relations of the constituent relation of the body. As a body attempts to extricate itself from a decompositional, we might say pestilential relation, its capacity for affectivity is rigidified, and its degree of power is decreased accordingly. Quote, "This is what is meant by my power decreases. It is not that I have less power. It is that a part of my power is subtracted, in the sense that it is necessarily allocated to averting the action of the thing. Everything happens as if a whole part of my power is no longer at my disposal. A part of my power is fixed." It is on this basis that Deleuze renounces abstract transcendent moral codes applied from without, such as Christian doctrine. In an encounter, ethics manifests itself through the direct designation of values of good and bad. Quote, "The good is when a body directly compounds its relationship with ours, and, with all or part of its power, increases ours. The bad is when a body decomposes our body's relation, although it still combines with our parts, but in ways that do not correspond to our essence. Ethics, in a sense, emanates from our affects. Good and bad are relative values derived from bodily impulses, and therefore secondary to them. However, all of this would be nothing without the inner dynamism which prompts a body to form encounters and maximize affective capacities for life. For the substantiation of this dynamic compulsion, Deleuze draws upon Spinoza's theory of the conatus. Each thing, Spinoza says, insofar as it is capable, endeavors to persevere in its being. This is characteristic of all things in nature. From this mechanical definition, Spinoza quickly moves to a dynamic definition, whereby if a body is constituted by an appetite to persevere in its own being, then it will necessarily have a desire for those things which will help it to do so. In this way, the body in question will maximize the power to exist. This transition is crucial for Deleuze, as it allows him to account for why a body should strive for encounters, and why, ultimately, it may live a good life, accreting relations and intensifying its power. It is the coruscating keystone of his ethical strategy. Yet what Deleuze conveniently obfuscates is that, as commentators who are less enthusiastic than he have observed, Spinoza's theory of the conatus is riddled, one might say lousy, with a number of, as what Jonathan Bennett says, are disgracefully bad arguments, which undermine the conatus and weaken it. Thus, in the move from a mechanistic definition to a dynamic definition, Bennett claims that, quote, what Spinoza regularly assumes is not that people have an austere Spinozist appetite for self-preservation, but rather that they want it, seek it, pursue it in the normal teleological senses of these terms. That is to say, Spinoza, and Deleuze after him, helps himself to a teleological doctrine of self-preservation to which he is not entitled. Unfortunately, I don't have time to explore the profound implications of this in more detail, but I hope it will suffice to say that in his uncritical adoption of Spinoza's theory of the conatus, Deleuze weakens the effectiveness of his own ethical corpus, exposing it to accusations of teleology and anthropocentrism. From this perspective, far from being an impartial description of the motivational force of life which is legitimately derived from the material conditions of existence, Deleuze's conatus appears rather as a normative prescription. Similarly, his ethology, seems no less imposed upon the materiality of the world than the transcendent systems of morality and ethics that it would seek to supplant. Matthew Simmons' final story, Burzum, which concludes his collection, begins, quote, "End where you start. That's what they say. End it all at the place where you start." To conclude, then, we return to black metal, yet it feels like we've never left. Thank you.
Thanks, Dermot. Our last presentation of the day is from Paul Ennis, and it's called Bleak Theory.
So today I want to explore some of the shared themes of two unlikely bedfellows, namely black metal theory and various continental realism that have emerged in the past decade. So I want to focus on black metal theory itself as opposed to black metal. But I also want to mark a small difference between them, in so much as I consider continental realism to be bleak rather than black. Maybe even, if such a thing is possible, bleaker than black. By continental realisms, I mean the various forms of contemporary continental philosophy that black metal theory bears similarities with, encompassing thinkers such as Meillassoux, Ray Bradbury, Lowell, Ben Woodard, Ian Grant, Nick Land, and so on. Now, a lot of what I have to say here derives from having recently read Eugene Thacker's monograph, Inclusive of This Planet, which is actually available in the Winding Staircase Facebook on Next. It's not difficult to see that Thacker's timely book occupies an interesting position in terms of this workshop. He is somewhat associated with speculative realism, but is also clearly interested in black metal. But his interests extend far beyond these two. The book covers everything from demons, nature of speculation, Dante, Milton, and more besides. Now, where he aligns with some of the less than merry strands of speculative is in his fundamentally pessimistic outlook, but also manifesting his desire to broach the topic of the unhuman. Now, the notion of the unhuman remains pretty vague throughout his book, but then again, it is not a book that aims to know, but in an almost Landian sense, intends to plumb the depths of unknown. And just like Land, Thacker refuses to define the weirdness of this project, no matter the direction it takes him in. However, despite its range, there is a lot that goes unsaid in Thacker's book. This guided tour of the unhuman pushes us along, but why we should be engaging with it is demonstrated vicariously, principally through the subtle background authority of Schopenhauer. Now, I should note that in the past few days, an article by Thacker entitled Dark Light, Negation, Nothingness, and the Will to Life from Schopenhauer has appeared, which does get around to doing this theoretical work, so it's worth checking out. But I suspect Schopenhauer's philosophy appeals to Thacker because it is geared toward various forms of depersonalization. And a lot of what is being discussed today, I think, is this kind of desire to think what's depersonalized, impersonalized, beyond mere human concerns. Now, Schopenhauer's vision of this process allows us to see human life as belonging to a shared zone of imminent suffering. And so it teaches us not to take things too personally. So there is surely an opening into empathy here, but Schopenhauer's pessimism is absolute. The only light he lets enter the world is to be found in temporary aesthetic or quasi-religious insight. And even these we are supposed to be cautious about. In Nietzsche, all this is made a little more buoyant, but it's still oriented toward learning to be battling with a hideous universe. But in the end, Thacker takes two things from Schopenhauer: an interest in the impersonal as what is truly unhuman, and a dose of the cosmic pessimism that comes to trying to think about that which is utterly alien and indifferent to us. Now, the rise in recent years of philosophies inclined toward the question of the inhuman has been remarkable. I suspect this is down to the influence of the Deleuzian-inspired cosmic metaphysics of Nick Land, whose name has come up repeatedly. And it's re-emerged in recent years through the people who worked under on the work. In Ian Grant, there is an attempt to construct a geo-philosophy adequate to our planetary condition, This is a theme that reoccurs in Haeckel's description of the unhuman. Ray Brazier evokes the spectre of land when, toward the end of Nickel Unbound, we are left to fend for ourselves against externalized entropic forces. He has a vision of the end of the universe in the book. But the lineage of the impersonal goes back a little further than that. Heidegger, for instance, had his own sustained fascination with the impersonal and the unhuman. I do not mean to bring up the reading of his later work as inaugurating a turn away from Dasein toward its end. As always with Heidegger, it's weirder than that. Dasein, after all, is not supposed to be anything or anyone. And if you spend enough time thinking like a Heideggerian, which I did for many years, you're guaranteed to have moments when the kind of nothingness Thacker likes to evoke does creep up on you. Now, once you start to think about it, Dasein, which basically just means being there, really does come across as extraordinarily peculiar. It spends a lot of its time being infested by language, which is simultaneously a place where its connection to being can be expressed, and also an easily overrun fortress that can be successfully invaded by techno-scientific jargon. And when you hook this up with Heidegger's epochal shifts, then the impersonal forces operative in the schema start to look downright ominous, despite the faint hope of saving power being held in reserve. So what Heidegger certainly did inaugurate was an extreme departure from the original intention of transcendental phenomenology, which was precisely that, a transcendental rather than an ontological project. But even here one finds the fingerprints, so to speak, of the impersonal. The transcendental field, after all, belongs to one and all, and so, like Dasein, belongs to no one in particular. And this aspect of the transcendental field still remains contentious. The transcendental is at once housed in the human body, and also in its sense-making function is to be considered as somehow distinct or separate from it. It is not quite human, but not exactly unhuman either. So, in terms of Heidegger, this is a grey area. It's not clear whether he believes humans existed before Dasein, or whether Dasein was already inscribed in human. If not, there are some strange questions to answer, such as at what point do we change from pre-Dasein to Dasein proper? Were we, in some sense, proto-Daseins or inarticulate Dasein, and the pre-Socratic simply gave voice to what has always belonged to us? The exact status of Dasein as human or unhuman is extremely ambiguous. And this is to say nothing of what swept into it, and which it is supposed to be responding to. In the maze of Heidegger's quirky historical procession of being, we find such broad questions as to what precisely is this way of being in terms of its direction, or whether it threatens through the erasure of its potential, or its positive potentiality to subsume Dasein into the shell, which is kind of his name for technological thinking. All of this has the feel of the impersonal, and of Dasein is not quite being in control of the destiny. If we leap even further back, we find that the transcendental field was first described by Kant as generating a calm island amidst the tumultuous sea of impersonal extraneous forces. It's only when we start to reflect on the guarantor, the field where the eye can emerge from, that we get a taste for its strangeness. Once there, we find that the personal relies on the impersonal, such that Kant's philosophy can be seen as, at once, overly determinative of the outside world and overly determined by something which does not quite seem to belong to our own flowing world of a coherent ego of our eye. And once you begin to trace how dependent the eye is on impersonal forces, it's only a matter of time before you begin to see the eye as a densely concentrated, discrete packet amidst the wider flow. And so it is not entirely surprising that post-Kantian philosophy wanted to focus a little more on this big flow. So Schopenhauer named this the will, Nietzsche the will to power. And it's not merely what is not I or out there, but what generates egos. It lets egos be, or to borrow from Heidegger, just plain gives as gift. This way of thinking belongs, when one takes the long view, to the slow motion deconstruction of the Cartesian ego in post-Kantian philosophy, albeit with Husserl putting a lonely revivalist figure here. And today the ego is trounced everywhere. But there is perhaps no better example than the no self at all argument of Metzinger, literally argues that there is no self. But even the one object amongst many theses of object-oriented ontology traces a similar line, although they would not want to be compared to each other. This destruction of the Cartesian subject may have its lineage in Kant, but the notion of the impersonal as a force, a process, or a will lies more in Hegel. In his metaphysics, Hegel presents us with a cosmic loop. At the beginning, the unarticulated notion, naming what is at the heart of the real, sets off without knowledge of itself. With the emergence of thinking subjects, the notion is finally able to think itself, and so the gap between the unarticulated and articulated notion is closed. The entire thing sets off again in directions as yet unknown. Absolute knowing is, after all, not totalized knowing, but a constant vigilant knowing, navigating its way through contingency and recognizing the necessity to go alone. But that's just the thing. Despite being important conduits to this process and having a quite special and specific function, it's the impersonal process that really counts. So although we are currently, at least in my own and many of the people here, in our own little corner of the discipline, undergoing something akin to a turn against anthropocentrism toward the impersonal, or as Packer posits, the unhuman. This is a pattern that has been, I believe, present in tradition for quite some time. What is different is how the question of the unhuman comes today not from inside philosophy, but from a number of external pressures. And what can only be described as a tragic situation for philosophers, truth now seeps into the discipline from the outside. We see thinking these days where philosophers promised there wasn't any. And black metal is a kind of perfect example of this, where the most interesting sort of philosophy events that I tend to go to are always those that aren't actual philosophy conferences. So Packer's brilliance lies in reminding us how this is an immense opportunity for philosophers to wake up from various self-induced slumbers, even if that means stepping outside the protected circle from time to time. In practice, this involves facing up to what is hidden in shadows rather than text, immersing oneself in the impersonal aspects of an imminent real in order to generate a confrontation with the horrors it has on offer. This is the task of thinking about thinking subjects as they exist in their not quite at home situation, within an indifferent and alien cosmos. The cold world is Dominic Fox put it. So here we should resist the temptation to think of thinking as a blessing. That, somewhat paradoxically, is also a burden one is supposed to stoically accept. In place of this, I suggest following those thinkers attuned to cosmologically inspired pessimism, to argue for human consciousness as an error or aberration. And so, to borrow from Zizek, one begins from the assumption that when it came to human consciousness, something went terribly wrong. Or, in cheerier terms, works wonders but can just as easily generate terrors. Whatever the case, what went wrong was the emergence of an entity that has the capacity to know too much. And in contemporary continental realism, this is a desire to really speed up, because only then will one be acting faithful to the accelerated nature of how things now pan out. An attempt perhaps to catch up with the pace of the impersonal and the unhuman. And of course, there's madness to this. One knows that we are the ones who know too much, and in response we seek to know more. No wonder then that there are so many pessimists among us. Now, seeking out harmful knowledge is work for heretics, and that's why I suspect Packer's demonology seems like a good fit. We're demonologists summoning we know not what. Ultimately, heresy arises from the allure of the untaught and the disparate. It means taking up the vocation of giving voice to the edges of the world. Fled of any theological or ontological comfort, which is essentially comfort within reason, one becomes akin to an inverted Hegelian, thinking Hegel without hope through the celebration of contingent, impersonal forces that will not bend to human reason, and more importantly, have nothing to do with it. That's reason without comfort. And this is why the weak theologians of continental philosophy have so forcefully responded to the threat of continental realism. Whereas hope continues to function in a landscape of religion without religion, continental realists respond with quasi-apocalyptic cosmological visions of the end of the universe, the extinction of the human race, volcanic eruption, oil spills, and so on. All things from the outside. Continental realists are absolutely committed to the thesis that everything tends towards precipitation. Everything desires to become, as Land would put it, the zero sum. It does not matter if right now we see within the localized field of life a straining for abundance, because the drive toward exploration is inscribed even within the beginnings of life, being toward death in the language of Heidegger. When Capullo rails against continental realists for their disinterest in the problems of the human condition, he finds his arguments not quite hitting the spot. That is because these thinkers are not blind to the problems he presents, but they simply find the solution of remaining amidst paradox frustrating, if only because they can't even bring themselves to remain anywhere for too long. Remaining itself is a solution put forward by Santiago Zavala in his recent monograph, The Remains of Being. One is supposed to remain or stay with being, sustain it through a prelude prior to saving power. And one does so by loitering around the remains of being. Eventually you're supposed to pass the torch on to the next person with an act of fundamental intelligence. Caputo is doing something similar when he remains with the problematic of religion by praying through his tears. But for continental realists, the problem is precisely the human, all-too-human nature of prayer, a ritual of the silent voice running through the self alone, and relentlessly demonstrating, in the absence of God, its own inwardness. In sharp contrast to Zavala and Caputo, we find Ayaka pointing out that what we have today is not the remains of being, but the decrepit ruins of being, the site where being is doubled up and bent over backwards. We still write, as Ayaka notes, precisely because we exist amidst the ruins of being. And so, however harsh the ruins may be, or as black as our thoughts may get, there is still beauty to be found in bleak landscapes. And that is where we should go, making our way towards an aesthetics of bleak to black to the ruins.
Thanks, Paul. And very good timing because we have to be out of here like now. So just before we finish, I just want to thank everybody for coming along, everybody who's watching the live stream, and particularly thank all of the speakers for the presentations, and also Vincent and Camelia for sharing their art with us. And a big thank you to Sandro at Radical Matters for facilitating the live stream, and also thanks to Hugh McKay for photographing the event. Check out his blog, Traces of the really amazing photographs. So thank you to everyone, and please do stay in touch with us about future Black, Bleak, and other types of events. Cheers.